In 1869, on a slope above Carson Valley, a Douglas County lumberman named James W. Haynes drove the first nail into a wooden trough shaped like the letter V. He had pine planks 2 feet wide and 16 feet long, joined at a 90-degree angle, propped on a trestle that fell away down the mountain. He filled it with water from a high creek. He floated a green log down it. The log did not jam. The log did not roll. The log rode the center of the V, perfectly self-centered, and arrived at the valley floor in minutes, not days. Within 20 years, men like Haynes and Dwayne L. Bliss would extend that simple V across the Sierra Nevada for over 80 miles in total length, carrying 500,000 board feet of lumber a day to the Comstock mines and the San Joaquin railheads, on trestles that rose 125 feet above the canyon floor. I pulled these names from the Forest History Society Photographic Archive and the records of the Carson and Tahoe Lumber and Fluming Company at the University of Nevada, Reno. This is the story they tell. I want to introduce you to 2 men before we go any further, because the V-Flume is not really an engineering story. It is a story about the men who wrote it, built it, and walked it in the dark. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the workers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button. Come back. The first is James W. Haynes himself. He was born in the East, settled in Douglas County, Nevada, and by 1866 he was cutting timber on his own land at the foot of the Kingsbury Grade above Carson Valley. He was a working lumberman, not a banker, not a financier. In the spring of 1869, he filed for a patent on the V-shaped flume. He later became a Douglas County state senator. A United States District Court would eventually rule that so many other lumber companies had already copied his design that he had lost the right to collect royalties on it. He invented the most efficient lumber transport of the 19th century, and he died without ever getting paid for it. The records on him are thin in places, but the patent claim is documented, and the trade press of Carson Valley named him as the first man to make a V-flume work. The second is Dwayne Leroy Bliss. Born in Savoy, Massachusetts in 1833. Lost his mother at age 13. Shipped out as a cabin boy to South America for 2 years, came home, taught school for 1 year, and quit to chase the California gold rush in 1849. He was 17 years old when he stepped off the steamer in San Francisco in 1850. He worked a small mining claim, made enough to buy into a hotel on the San Francisco Peninsula, then moved to Gold Hill, Nevada in 1860 to manage a quartz mill. In 1870, he bought 160 acres of timberland near Spooner Summit above Lake Tahoe. 3 years later, he founded the Carson and Tahoe Lumber and Fluming Company and built a V-flume 12 miles long that ran from the summit down Clear Creek Canyon to a yard 1 mile south of Carson City. Over the next 23 years, he and his men cut 750 million board feet of old-growth timber out of the Tahoe Basin and fed every plank of it to the Comstock mines. They called him the grand old man of Lake Tahoe before he died. These 2 men, Haynes and Bliss, are the bookends of this story. One invented the trough. The other ran the largest V-flume operation the West ever saw. Hold them in your mind. Let me walk you through what a V-flume actually was, because if you have only ever seen a theme park log ride, you have the wrong picture in your head. A real V-flume was 2 rough pine planks. Each plank was 1.5 inches thick, 24 inches wide, and 16 feet long. The 2 planks were joined together along their long edge at a perfect 90-degree angle, forming a triangular trough that opened upward like a roof beam laid on its side, only inverted. That triangle was the cross-section. 2 feet of water down each sloping side, an open top, no bottom. The bottom was the joint itself, a sharp V running the length of the line. That V shape was the entire secret of the thing. James W. Haynes had watched square box flumes for years. Square flumes worked, sort of, but logs in a square channel could turn sideways, jam against the walls, and stop the whole line. When 2 logs jammed in a square flume, the water just ran around them and kept going, and you sent men out with poles to break the jam by hand. In a V, 2 logs that jammed would back the water up behind them. The water would rise. The rising water would float both logs into the wider section of the V above the jam. The logs would lift free. The line would clear itself. Haynes tested it in 1867. He filed his patent in 1869. By 1879, less than a decade later, there were 10 V flumes running in the Sierra Nevada, totaling more than 80 miles of trough. The V did one more thing that mattered even more. It self-centered the load. Drop a 16-foot pine log into a flat box flume, and it lands wherever gravity puts it, often against one wall, dragging, slowing the line, splitting the lumber. Drop the same log into a V, and it slides immediately down both sloping faces to the bottom of the joint, perfectly centered, balanced, riding the apex of the water column. No drag. No split. No man with a pry pole. The flume itself did the work. There is one more piece of the geometry that is easy to miss. The 90-degree angle of the V is exactly right for the way water and wood interact at speed. If the angle is too shallow, the trough has to be wider and uses more lumber and more water. If the angle is too steep, the V becomes too deep, the logs ride too low, and the friction along the joint slows them down. 90 degrees is the balance point. Haynes did not arrive at that angle by calculation. He arrived at it by trying square, trying half circle, trying steeper and shallower V shapes, and watching what the logs did in each one. He picked the angle that worked. The fact that it also happened to use the least lumber per running foot was a bonus the lumber companies discovered after the fact. Now picture that trough running for 54 miles, hung on wooden trestles, falling 4,200 feet from a mountain mill to a valley yard. That is what these men actually built. The trestles are the part most people forget. The V flume itself was just two boards. The structure that held those two boards on grade across the Sierra Nevada was an entirely separate engineering achievement. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, I am putting them into a series of books. The men nobody wrote a book about, the ones who built this country with their hands. Volume 1 is out now. Scan the code on your screen or click the link in the description. Then come back, because what happened next is the part most people never hear. Every trestle was hand-cut from pine and cedar, framed on site, and raised by crews working with block and tackle. Where the flume crossed a shallow ravine, the trestle might be 20 feet high. Where it crossed Kings Canyon, the trestles spanning the river rose anywhere from 50 feet to 125 feet above the canyon floor. As the flume approached the steepest sections of the main river canyon, the construction crews would pre-build the trestle bents in pieces on the mountain above, haul them down by rope, and assemble them on the canyon walls themselves, anchoring the timber into living granite. The Sanger Depot Museum in Fresno County still holds the construction photographs. You can see the men standing on top of bents that drop straight down to white water, balancing on a 4-inch plank with no rail and no harness. A continuous grade was the other discipline. Water will run only one way, and only at the angle gravity gives it. The flume had to drop steadily from the head to the yard, never level off, never rise even an inch, or the water would pool and the logs would stop. On the Kings River flume, that drop was 4,200 feet of elevation over 54 miles of horizontal run, which works out to a steady fall of about 78 feet per mile, or roughly 1.5% grade. The surveyors held that grade through canyons, around granite shoulders, and across ravines using nothing more than transit, chain, and stake. When the survey crews finished a section, the trestle builders followed them and built the bents to match the line on the ground. The water came from a dam at the head. Most of the Sierra flumes were fed by impounded snowmelt. Bliss fed his Clear Creek flume from Marlette Lake high on the Carson Range. The Kings River flume drew from streams that fed the Kings River itself. Later, when John Eastwood took over the Hume Bennett operation, he built an entirely new reservoir, Hume Lake, as a dedicated flume head and extended the line another 17 miles. By the early 1900s, the Hume to Sanger flume ran 73 miles. The records at the Sanger Depot Museum call it the longest log flume ever built. A word on the wood. The body of the V on the Kings River flume was built entirely from knot-free sequoia. Not pine, not cedar, not fir. Sequoia, the same giant trees the flume was built to harvest, sawn into clean, 2-foot-wide planks with not a single knot in the grain. A knot in the joint would have leaked. A leak would have cost water, slowed logs, and rotted the surrounding wood. The lumber crews at the mill picked through every board before it went into the flume body. The trestles below the V were built from pine and cedar, which were cheaper and more available, but the trough itself was sequoia. 9 million board feet of it for the Kings River line alone. The companies were so committed to clean sequoia for the trough that they ran a separate sorting station at the mill to set aside the knot-free boards before any of the rest of the lumber went out for sale. The joints were caulked with oakum, the same tarred hemp fiber used to seal the hulls of wooden sailing ships. Crews of caulkers worked behind the carpenters, hammering oakum into every seam with iron irons and wooden mallets, then coating the inside of the V with a thin layer of pitch to seal the wood. A well-built section of V flume would hold water without leaking for a full cutting season, sometimes 2 or 3. The herders carried small kegs of oakum and pitch on their rounds to patch any small leak they found before it grew into a washout. The water came down. The logs came down. And so did the men. This is where the job gets dangerous, and where the men we know least about did their work. The flume herders. A flume herder was a worker assigned a section of the flume line, usually 5 to 10 miles, and his job was to ride or walk that section every day, looking for trouble. Trouble was a leaking joint, a sagging trestle, a broken plank, a log jam, a low water spot where the line had to be regulated by lifting a gate. The herder carried a long pole with an iron hook on the end, called a pike pole. He used it to push loose logs along, to lift jammed timbers, to chop ice from the bottom of the V in winter. He worked alone, in all weather, often miles from the nearest mill or camp. The way the herders moved along their section is what made the job famous in the Carson Valley trade press of the 1880s. Sometimes they walked the catwalk that ran beside the trough. Sometimes they hopped onto a passing log and rode it down the line, balanced on top of a pine board with 2 feet of water under them and a 100-foot drop on either side of the trestle. And sometimes, on the larger flumes, they used a small, custom-built craft called a flume boat. The flume boat was shaped exactly like the V of the flume itself. 2 flat boards joined at a 90-degree angle, open at the top, pointed at the bow, with no oars and no engine. The herder sat or knelt inside it, and the water carried him at the same speed as the logs, sometimes 40 or 50 miles an hour on the steep sections. It was the fastest commercial transportation on the West Coast in the 1880s. Faster than the horse, faster than the freight wagon, sometimes faster than the railroad on a steep grade. A loaded train took 15 hours to cover the same 54-mile distance from the Kings River Mills to the Sanger Yard. The flume did it in less time. The herder on his V-boat covered it in well under that. The ledger gives no name, only a number, for most of these men. I have looked through the surviving payroll books from the Carson and Tahoe Lumber and Fluming Company on file at the University of Nevada, and the herders appear as initials and a daily rate, nothing more. They were paid by the section, by the day, sometimes by the month. They lived in plank shanties pinned to the side of the flume itself. They ate cold food because no fire was allowed near a dry wooden trough. They died sometimes, swept off the catwalk by a sudden surge of water from above, or pitched off a trestle in a windstorm, or crushed under a logjam they were trying to clear. The trade press recorded the deaths the way it recorded weather, as a line item, a number for the season. The flume herders have one more job that the photographs rarely show. They were the men who watched the line in winter. A Sierra winter on a wooden flume could close the operation for weeks. Snow drifted into the open trough. Ice formed at the bottom of the V where the water sat slowest. A herder making his rounds in February or March had to chip the ice out of the joint with a long-handled ice chisel, sometimes hanging by a rope from the catwalk above a 100-foot trestle in a snowstorm. He had to inspect every bent for snow load. He had to know which spans had cracked in the cold and which had not. He had to make the call to call up the head and tell the gateman to hold the water back another day, or to release it because a thaw was coming and a sudden runoff would tear the whole line apart. The herders kept the line alive through the off-season. Without them, the spring opening would have meant a full rebuild every year. With them, the same flume could run 10, 15, 20 seasons. I want to go back to the dam and the head of the flume because the water management at the top is the part of the engineering most people miss when they look at the old photographs. The dam at the head of a Sierra flume was usually a low timber crib structure backed up against a creek or a small lake. The crib was filled with rock and faced with planks. A wooden penstock, basically a square wooden pipe, carried water from behind the dam into a headgate at the very top of the flume. The headgate was a vertical plank slider, lifted by a crank on a wooden frame. When the head gateman cranked the slider up, water poured into the V. When he cranked it down, the water cut off. On the longest flumes, the head gateman had no way to talk to the men downstream. He worked by schedule and by signal. When the gate opened in the morning, every man along the 73 miles of line knew water was coming. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, join the Boss tier for $4.99 a month. Loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public, and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now back to it. The volume of water at the head of a working Sierra flume ran in the hundreds of cubic feet per second on the major systems. Enough to carry a 16-foot pine log at 30 miles an hour. Enough to wash a man off the catwalk if he was standing in the wrong place when the gate opened. The flume herders kept watches and worked off the morning bell. If you were on the line when the bell rang, you had a fixed number of minutes to climb the trestle to the safety platform before the water reached your section. Men who misread the bell, or fell asleep on the catwalk, or who were caught in a snowstorm and lost track of the time, she sometimes did not climb fast enough. Honor the men who learned the bell the hard way. The mill above the flume was the other end of the operation. Every flume had a mill at its head, sometimes 2 or 3. The mill received the felled logs from the woods crews, ran them through the saw, and turned them into rough-cut lumber boards in standard sizes. The boards were stacked, bundled, and at the right moment dropped into the V. They rode the water down. At the yard at the bottom, men with pike poles pulled the boards out of the flume, stacked them on the lumber dock, and loaded them onto railroad cars bound for San Francisco, the Comstock, the Central Valley towns. The cycle from standing tree to rail car ran in days, sometimes hours, where the same cycle by horse wagon would have taken weeks. The bundling of the boards is worth a paragraph of its own. The California Lumber Company co-founder William Thurman developed a technique to clamp bundles of lumber together with iron straps before they entered the flume so that the boards would ride down the line as a single unit rather than scattering and jamming. He patented the flume clamp in 1877, the same year the first boards traveled the Madeira line. Every long flume after that used some version of the Thurman clamp or a competing design. Without bundling, you could not run finished lumber down the flume, only raw logs. With bundling, the V could move dressed boards in standard sizes from the mountain mill straight to the railroad dock, ready for sale. That single innovation turned the flume from a log mover into a lumber mover and changed the economics of the whole industry. The cost of building one of these flumes was staggering for the 1870s and 80s. The California Lumber Company built the first long Sierra flume between 1874 and 1877, 54 miles down to Madeira, at a documented cost of $250,000 in 1877 dollars. The Kings River flume, completed in 1890, cost $300,000 and consumed 9 million board feet of its own lumber, just for the flume body and the trestles. The Kings River flume body was built entirely of knot-free sequoia, the trestles of pine and cedar, all of it cut on site from the same forests. The flume was built to harvest. That cost in modern dollars runs above $10 million for the Kings River system alone. The investors who put up that money were taking a real risk. A flume could fail in any of a dozen ways. A spring flood at the head could wash out the dam. A summer drought could empty the head pond. A winter storm could blow down 100 bents in one night. A forest fire could erase a 5-mile section in an afternoon. The companies that survived were the ones that built strong, hired strong, and kept good herders on the line. The ones that did not survive failed quickly. The Madeira operation collapsed inside 3 seasons in 1877, brought down by a single dry year. The investors lost their money. The flume sat empty until the reorganization brought new capital in. That is the pattern across the whole industry. Build a flume, run it for 2 or 3 good years, lose a season to drought or fire, and either the company has the reserves to bridge the gap or it does not. The economics that made it pay were tight but real. A loaded freight wagon hauling lumber from a Sierra mill to the Valley railhead in 1880 cost the company around $15 to $20 per 1,000 board feet, by the time the teamster, the horses, the road repair, and the time were all counted. The same 1,000 board feet down a working V flume cost between 50 cents and $1.50 depending on the line. That is a ratio of 10 or 15 to 1 in favor of the flume, and it explains why the lumber companies were willing to put up hundreds of thousands of dollars and risk a season's revenue to build them. Once a flume was running and the water was holding, every 1,000 board feet of lumber that went down the V was carrying nearly pure margin to the company yard at the bottom. The men who built them and ran them knew this. Bliss paid his herders better than the carpenters, because the herders were the men keeping the cash flow alive. The men who built these flumes were paid by the day. The construction wage records on the major Sierra systems are partial, scattered across company ledgers and trade press notes from the period. The Carson and Tahoe Lumber and Fluming Company payroll books at the University of Nevada show carpenter wages in the range of $2.50 to $3 per day in the 1870s and 80s for skilled flume builders. Common laborers were paid less, usually $1.50 to $2 per day. The herders fell somewhere in between, paid by the section. The exact figures vary by company and by year, and I want to be honest with you, the wage data on individual flume crews is one of the things I have not been able to pin down to a single defensible number across all 6 systems. Where I can confirm it, I will say so. Where I cannot, I will say that too. What I can tell you is that the work was constant during the cutting season, May through October in most years, and the crews were fed and housed by the company in plank camps along the line. The men were mostly American-born, with a steady minority of European immigrants in the carpentry trades, German and Scandinavian, by the surviving names. The herders were often older men, second-career lumbermen who had lost too much to the saw to keep working it, men who knew the line and the water and could be trusted to walk 50 miles a day in any weather. Bliss kept herders on his Clear Creek line for 10 and 12 seasons running. They knew every joint, every bent, every weak board. The construction crews worked in a different rhythm. A flume the length of the Kings River system took 15 to 18 months to build, working from both ends toward the middle. The survey crew went first, holding the grade with transit and chain. Behind them came the right-of-way crew, clearing brush and small timber and grading the bench cuts where the flume would sit on the slope. Then the trestle crew, raising the bents in order from low to high. Then the trough crew, laying the V on top of the bents. Then the caulkers, sealing the joints. Then the water crew at the head, building the dam and the head gate. 5 separate trades, each one waiting on the one ahead of it, all of them working their way down a mountain at the same time. When the head gate finally opened in the spring of 1890, every man on the Kings River line had been working on that single flume for over a year. The first water that ran down the V on September 3rd, 1890, was the work of more than 500 carpenters, millmen, teamsters, and laborers, all of them paid in cash on a Friday afternoon at the company yard in Sanger. The fluming companies did not last forever. The economics that made them work depended on 3 things at once. They needed standing timber within reach of a creek that could be dammed. They needed a market at the bottom, willing to pay rail shipping prices for the lumber. And they needed enough snowpack and rainfall every year to keep the head ponds full. When any one of those failed, the flume stopped. The California Lumber Company, the first of the long systems, went down in the 1877 drought after only 3 cutting seasons. There simply was not enough water in the head ponds to run the flume. The company was reorganized in 1878 as the Madeira Flume and Trading Company. The Madera Sugar Pine Company took over the operation later and ran a 60 to 65-mile flume into the early 1900s. The Carson and Tahoe Lumber and Fluming Company shut down its timber operation around 1896 when the Tahoe Basin had been cut over and the Comstock mines were going dark. Bliss turned the same boats and the same land into a tourist business and started building hotels around Lake Tahoe. The Kings River Flume, extended by Hume to 73 miles, ran until 1923, when fire and the simple exhaustion of the Sequoia stands above Hume Lake finally ended the operation. What happened to the flumes themselves is the strangest part of the story. This way, the flumes did not get torn down. They were too long, too remote, too high in the mountains to dismantle. When the cutting was finished, the company simply let the headgates close and walked away. The water stopped. The wooden V dried out. The pine planks cracked and warped in the sun. The trestles began to lean. Storms took the highest bents first. Snow loads collapsed the longer spans. Forest fires burned through the dry trough lengths. In some places, the V flume body, made of knot-free sequoia, lay on the ground for decades before it rotted, because sequoia resists decay the way no other Sierra wood does. If you walk certain trails in the western Sierra Nevada today, in El Dorado County, in Tuolumne County, in Fresno County above Sanger, you can still find pieces of these flumes. A short stretch of Sequoia V on the ground, the two boards still joined at their 90-degree angle, weathered silver, settled in among the new growth. A bent leaning against a granite face above a creek, the iron spikes still in the wood. The Truckee Donner Historical Society has photographs of flume herders and flume boats and flume trestles in operation, taken in the 1880s, and you can match them to the surviving wood on the ground today. There is one stretch of the old Carson and Tahoe line in Clear Creek Canyon, below the site of the original Marlette Lake headgate, where a section of the V still sits where it fell. The trestle bents underneath are gone, taken by snow and fire and time. The V itself is on the ground, the two boards still pinned together by hand-cut iron spikes, the joint still tight after 130 years. You can stand next to it. You can run your hand along the inside of the V, the same surface that carried the lumber for the Comstock mines from 1873 to 1896. The wood is silver and cold. The grain is still tight enough to read. The men who cut that wood and joined those boards are in the ground a long time, but the work is still there. I have walked one of these old flume lines myself, on the eastern slope above Carson Valley where James W. Haynes built his first V in 1869. There is almost nothing left. A few stones from a head dam that is long since washed out. A pile of weathered planks at the foot of a slope where a trestle came down in some forgotten winter. A clear path through the second-growth pine that follows the contour line of where the flume must have been. The transit men who surveyed that grade in 1869 left their work in the shape of the ground itself, and the ground still holds it. Haynes never collected royalties on his patent. The court took that away from him in the 1870s. He died a state senator and a working lumberman, not a wealthy man. Dwayne L. Bliss outlived him and ended his life rich, the founder of a Lake Tahoe steamship company and a hotel empire. But he started as a 17-year-old cabin boy with nothing. And what he built with his own hands and the hands of 500 men on his payroll at the peak. The herders, the carpenters, the saw filers, the head gatemen, almost none of them have names that survive. The ledger gives no name, only a number, for the man who first rode a V-boat down Clear Creek Canyon in 1875, and the man who fell off a trestle in Kings Canyon in 1892, and the man who held the headgate at Marlette Lake through 43 cutting seasons. They are in the ground under the new growth, and the silver wood of the old flume bodies marks the place. I started reading the flume records about 3 years ago because a friend in Fresno showed me a photograph of a man kneeling inside a V-boat, water spraying over the bow, the canyon falling away on both sides. I asked him who the man was. He told me nobody knows. I have been trying to learn the man's name ever since, and I have not found it yet. The Forest History Society archive lists him as Flume Herder, Kings River, circa 1895. That is all. What I have learned instead is what the man knew. How the V centered the log. How the bell signaled the water. How the bent had be plumb to the granite. How 78 feet of fall per mile would carry a 16-foot pine board 60 miles down a wooden trough faster than any horse in California could run. I am honored to know it, and I am honored to tell it to you. Honor the men who built the Flumes, and honor the men who rode them. One more thing before you go. Every name I find, every number, every record, I am collecting it all into a series of books so these men are not forgotten again. Volume 1 is available right now. Scan the code on your screen, or follow the link in the description. See you in the next one.